Elizabeth II, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, April 21, 1926 to September 8, 2022, one was Queen of the United Kingdom and of 14 other sovereign countries from February 6, 1952 until her death. Her reign of 70 years and 7 months was the longest of any British monarch. Elizabeth was born in Mayfair, London, as the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Her father acceded to the throne in 1936 upon the abdication of his brother, King Edward VIII, making Elizabeth the heir presumptive. She was educated privately at home and began to undertake public duties during the Second World War, serving in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. In November 1947, she married Philip Mountbatten, a former Prince of Greece and Denmark, and their marriage lasted 73 years until his death in April 2021. They had 4 children together: Charles, King of the United Kingdom, Anne, Princess Royal, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, and Prince Edward, Earl of Wessex. When her father died in February 1952, Elizabeth, then 25 years old, became Queen Regnant of 7 independent Commonwealth countries: the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon, known today as Sri Lanka, as well as head of the Commonwealth. Elizabeth reigned as a constitutional monarch through major political changes such as the Troubles in Northern Ireland, devolution in the United Kingdom, the decolonization of Africa, and the United Kingdom's accession to the European communities and withdrawal from the European Union. The number of her realms varied over time as territories have gained independence and some realms have become republics. Her many historic visits and meetings include state visits to China in 1986, Russia in 1994, the Republic of Ireland in 2011, and visits to or from 5 popes. Significant events include Elizabeth's coronation in 1953 and the celebrations of her silver, golden, diamond, and platinum jubilees in 1977, 2002, 2012, and 2022, respectively. Elizabeth was the longest-lived and longest-reigning British monarch, the oldest and longest-serving incumbent head of state, and the second-longest verifiable reigning sovereign monarch in world history. She faced occasional Republican sentiment and media criticism of her family, particularly after the breakdowns of her children's marriages, her annus horribilis in 1992, and the death of her former daughter-in-law Diana, Princess of Wales, in 1997. However, support for the monarchy in the United Kingdom remained consistently high, as did her personal popularity. Elizabeth died on September 8, 2022. Elizabeth II, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, April 21, 1926 to September 8, 2022, one was Queen of the United Kingdom and of 14 other sovereign countries from February 6, 1952 until her death. Her reign of 70 years and 7 months was the longest of any British monarch. Elizabeth was born in Mayfair, London, as the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Her father acceded to the throne in 1936 upon the abdication of his brother, King Edward VIII, making Elizabeth the heir presumptive. She was educated privately at home and began to undertake public duties during the Second World War, serving in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. In November 1947, she married Philip Mountbatten, a former Prince of Greece and Denmark, and their marriage lasted 73 years until his death in April 2021. They had 4 children together: Charles, King of the United Kingdom, Anne, Princess Royal, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, and Prince Edward, Earl of Wessex. When her father died in February 1952, Elizabeth, then 25 years old, became Queen Regnant of 7 independent Commonwealth countries: the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon, known today as Sri Lanka, as well as head of the Commonwealth. Elizabeth reigned as a constitutional monarch through major political changes such as the Troubles in Northern Ireland, devolution in the United Kingdom, the decolonization of Africa, and the United Kingdom's accession to the European communities and withdrawal from the European Union. The number of her realms varied over time as territories have gained independence and some realms have become republics. Her many historic visits and meetings include state visits to China in 1986, Russia in 1994, the Republic of Ireland in 2011, and visits to or from 5 popes. Significant events include Elizabeth's coronation in 1953 and the celebrations of her silver, golden, diamond, and platinum jubilees in 1977, 2002, 2012, and 2022, respectively. Elizabeth was the longest-lived and longest-reigning British monarch, the oldest and longest-serving incumbent head of state, and the second-longest verifiable reigning sovereign monarch in world history. She faced occasional Republican sentiment and media criticism of her family, particularly after the breakdowns of her children's marriages, her annus horribilis in 1992, and the death of her former daughter-in-law Diana, Princess of Wales, in 1997. However, support for the monarchy in the United Kingdom remained consistently high, as did her personal popularity. Elizabeth died on September 8, 2022. Contents. Early life. Elizabeth as a thoughtful-looking toddler with curly, fair hair. On the cover of Time, April 1929. Elizabeth as a rosy-cheeked young girl with blue eyes and fair hair. Portrait by Philip de Laszlo, 1933. Elizabeth was born at 2:40 GMT, on April 21, 1926, during the reign of her paternal grandfather, King George V. Her father, the Duke of York, later King George VI, was the second son of the king. Her mother, the Duchess of York, later Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, was the youngest daughter of Scottish aristocrat Claude Bowes-Lyon, 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, at whose London home, 17 Bruton Street, Mayfair, she was delivered by caesarean section. 3. She was baptized by the Anglican Archbishop of York, Cosmo Gordon Lang, in the private chapel of Buckingham Palace on 29 May 4C and named Elizabeth after her mother, Alexandra after her paternal great-grandmother, who had died 6 months earlier, and Mary after her paternal grandmother. 6. Called Lilibet by her close family. 7. Based on what she called herself at first. 8. She was cherished by her grandfather, George V, whom she affectionately called Grandpa England. 9. And her regular visits during his serious illness in 1929 were credited in the popular press and by later biographers with raising his spirits and aiding his recovery. 10. Elizabeth's only sibling, Princess Margaret, was born in 1930. The 2 princesses were educated at home under the supervision of their mother and their governess, Marian Crawford. 11 lessons concentrated on history, language, literature, and music. 12. Crawford published a biography of Elizabeth and Margaret's childhood years entitled The Little Princesses in 1950, much to the dismay of the royal family. 13. The book describes Elizabeth's love of horses and dogs, her orderliness, and her attitude of responsibility. 14. Others echoed such observations. Winston Churchill described Elizabeth when she was 2 as a character. She has an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant. 15. Her cousin Margaret Rhodes described her as a jolly little girl, but fundamentally sensible and well-behaved. 16. Heir presumptive. During her grandfather's reign, Elizabeth was 3rd in the line of succession to the British throne, behind her uncle Edward and her father. Although her birth generated public interest, she was not expected to become queen, as Edward was still young and likely to marry and have children of his own, who would precede Elizabeth in the line of succession. 17. When her grandfather died in 1936 and her uncle succeeded as Edward VIII, she became 2nd in line to the throne, after her father. Later that year, Edward abdicated, after his proposed marriage to divorced socialite Wallis Simpson provoked a constitutional crisis. 18. Consequently, Elizabeth's father became king, taking the regnal name George VI. Since Elizabeth had no brothers, she became heir presumptive. If her parents had subsequently born a son, he would have been heir apparent and above her in the line of succession, which was determined by male preference primogeniture at the time. 19. Elizabeth received private tuition in constitutional history from Henry Martin, vice provost of Eton College. 20 and learned French from a succession of native-speaking governesses. 21 A Girl Guides Company, the first Buckingham Palace company, was formed specifically so she could socialize with girls her own age. 22 Later, she was enrolled as a Sea Ranger. 21. In 1939, Elizabeth's parents toured Canada and the United States. As in 1927, when they had toured Australia and New Zealand, Elizabeth remained in Britain, since her father thought her too young to undertake public tours. 23 She looked tearful as her parents departed. 24 They corresponded regularly. 24 And she and her parents made the first royal transatlantic telephone call on May 18. 23. Second World War. In Auxiliary Territorial Service uniform, April 1945. In September 1939, Britain entered the Second World War. Lord Hailsham suggested that Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret should be evacuated to Canada to avoid the frequent aerial bombings of London by the Luftwaffe. 25 This was rejected by their mother, who declared, "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the king. And the king will never leave." 26. The princesses stayed at Balmoral Castle, Scotland, until Christmas 1939, when they moved to Sandringham House, Norfolk. 27 From February to May 1940, they lived at Royal Lodge, Windsor, until moving to Windsor Castle, where they lived for most of the next 5 years. 28 At Windsor, the princesses staged pantomimes at Christmas in aid of the Queen's Wool Fund, which bought yarn to knit into military garments. 29 In 1940, the 14-year-old Elizabeth made her first radio broadcast during the BBC's Children's Hour, addressing other children who had been evacuated from the cities. 30 She stated, "We are trying to do all we can to help our gallant sailors, soldiers, and airmen, and we are trying, too, to bear our own share of the danger and sadness of war. We know, every one of us, that in the end all will be well." 30. In 1943, Elizabeth undertook her first solo public appearance on a visit to the Grenadier Guards, of which she had been appointed colonel the previous year. 31 As she approached her 18th birthday, Parliament changed the law so she could act as one of 5 councillors of state in the event of her father's incapacity or absence abroad, such as his visit to Italy in July 1944. 32 In February 1945, she was appointed as an honorary second subaltern in the Auxiliary Territorial Service with the service number of 230,873. 33 She trained as a driver and mechanic and was given the rank of honorary junior commander, female equivalent of captain at the time, 5 months later. 34 35 36 Elizabeth, far left, on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with her family and Winston Churchill on May 8, 1945. At the end of the war in Europe, on Victory in Europe Day, Elizabeth and Margaret mingled incognito with the celebrating crowds in the streets of London. Elizabeth later said in a rare interview, "We asked my parents if we could go out and see for ourselves. I remember we were terrified of being recognized. I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall, all of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief." 37. During the war, plans were drawn up to quell Welsh nationalism by affiliating Elizabeth more closely with Wales. Proposals, such as appointing her constable of Caernarfon Castle or a patron of Ard Gabaith Cymru, the Welsh League of Youth, were abandoned for several reasons, including fear of associating Elizabeth with conscientious objectors in the Ard at a time when Britain was at war. 38 Welsh politicians suggested she be made Princess of Wales on her 18th birthday. Home Secretary Herbert Morrison supported the idea, but the king rejected it because he felt such a title belonged solely to the wife of a Prince of Wales and the Prince of Wales had always been the heir apparent. 39 In 1946, she was inducted into the Gorsedd of Bards at the National Eisteddfod of Wales. 40. Princess Elizabeth went on her first overseas tour in 1947, accompanying her parents through southern Africa. During the tour, in a broadcast to the British Commonwealth on her 21st birthday, she made the following pledge: "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong." 41. The speech was written by Dermot Mora, a journalist for The Times. 42. Marriage. Main article: Wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Philip Mountbatten. Posing for photographs at Buckingham Palace with new husband Philip after their wedding, 1947. Elizabeth met her future husband, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, in 1934 and again in 1937. 43. They were second cousins once removed through King Christian IX of Denmark and third cousins through Queen Victoria. After meeting for the third time at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth in July 1939, Elizabeth, though only 13 years old, said she fell in love with Philip, and they began to exchange letters. 44. She was 21 when their engagement was officially announced on July 9, 1947. 45. The engagement was not without controversy. Philip had no financial standing, was foreign-born, though a British subject who had served in the Royal Navy throughout the Second World War, and had sisters who had married German noblemen with Nazi links. 46. Marion Crawford wrote, "Some of the king's advisers did not think him good enough for her. He was a prince without a home or kingdom." Some of the papers played long and loud tunes on the string of Philip's foreign origin. 47. Later biographies reported that Elizabeth's mother had reservations about the union initially, and teased Philip as the Hun. 48-49. In later life, however, the Queen Mother told biographer Tim Heald that Philip was an English gentleman. 50. Before the marriage, Philip renounced his Greek and Danish titles, officially converted from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglicanism, and adopted the style Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, taking the surname of his mother's British family. 51. Shortly before the wedding, he was created Duke of Edinburgh and granted the style His Royal Highness. 7. At Westminster Abbey. They received 2,500 wedding gifts from around the world. 53. Elizabeth required ration coupons to buy the material for her gown, which was designed by Norman Hartnell, because Britain had not yet completely recovered from the devastation of the war. 54. In post-war Britain, it was not acceptable for Philip's German relations, including his 3 surviving sisters, to be invited to the wedding. 55. Neither was an invitation extended to the Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII. 56. Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Prince Charles, on November 14, 1948. 1 month earlier, the king had issued letters patent allowing her children to use the style and title of a royal prince or princess, to which they otherwise would not have been entitled as their father was no longer a royal prince. 57. A second child, Princess Anne, was born on August 15, 1950. 58. Following their wedding, the couple leased Windlesham Moor, near Windsor Castle, until July 1949-53 when they took up residence at Clarence House in London. At various times between 1949 and 1951, the Duke of Edinburgh was stationed in the British Crown colony of Malta as a serving Royal Navy officer. He and Elizabeth lived intermittently in Malta for several months at a time in the hamlet of Guardamanga, at Villa Guardamanga, the rented home of Philip's uncle, Lord Mountbatten. Their 2 children remained in Britain. 59. Reign. Accession and Coronation. Main article: Coronation of Elizabeth II. Coronation portrait with husband Philip, 1953. George VI's health declined during 1951, and Elizabeth frequently stood in for him at public events. When she toured Canada and visited President Harry S. Truman in Washington, D.C., in October 1951, her private secretary, Martin Charteris, carried a draft accession declaration in case of the king's death while she was on tour. 60 In early 1952, Elizabeth and Philip set out for a tour of Australia and New Zealand by way of Kenya. On February 6, 1952, they had just returned to their Kenyan home, Sagana Lodge, after a night spent at Treetops Hotel, when word arrived of the death of George VI and Elizabeth's consequent accession to the throne with immediate effect. Philip broke the news to the new queen. 61 She chose to retain Elizabeth as her regnal name. 62 Thus she was called Elizabeth II, which offended many Scots, as she was the first Elizabeth to rule in Scotland. 63 She was proclaimed queen throughout her realms and the royal party hastily returned to the United Kingdom. 64 Elizabeth and Philip moved into Buckingham Palace. 65 With Elizabeth's accession, it seemed probable that the royal house would bear the Duke of Edinburgh's name, in line with the custom of a wife taking her husband's surname on marriage. Lord Mountbatten advocated the name House of Mountbatten. Philip suggested House of Edinburgh, after his ducal title. 66 The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and Elizabeth's grandmother, Queen Mary, favoured the retention of the House of Windsor, so Elizabeth issued a declaration on April 9, 1952 that Windsor would continue to be the name of the royal house. The Duke complained, "I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." 67 In 1960, the surname Mountbatten-Windsor was adopted for Philip and Elizabeth's male line descendants who do not carry royal titles. 68 Amid preparations for the coronation, Princess Margaret told her sister she wished to marry Peter Townsend, a divorced 16 years Margaret Sr. and with 2 sons from his previous marriage. The Queen asked them to wait for a year. In the words of her private secretary, the Queen was naturally sympathetic towards the princess, but I think she thought she hoped given time, the affair would peter out. 69 Senior politicians were against the match and the Church of England did not permit remarriage after divorce. If Margaret had contracted a civil marriage, she would have been expected to renounce her right of succession. 70 Margaret decided to abandon her plans with Townsend. 71 Despite the death of Queen Mary on March 24, 1953, the coronation went ahead as planned on June 2, as Mary had requested before she died. 72 The coronation ceremony in Westminster Abbey, with the exception of the anointing and communion, was televised for the first time. 73 On Elizabeth's instruction, her coronation gown was embroidered with the floral emblems of Commonwealth countries. 77 Continuing evolution of the Commonwealth. Further information, Commonwealth realm from the accession of Elizabeth II. Elizabeth's realms, light red and pink, and their territories and protectorates, dark red, at the beginning of her reign in 1952. From Elizabeth's birth onwards, the British Empire continued its transformation into the Commonwealth of Nations. 78 By the time of her accession in 1952, her role as head of multiple independent states was already established. 79 In 1953, the Queen and her husband embarked on a 7-month round-the-world tour, visiting 13 countries and covering more than 40,000 miles, 64,000 kilometers, by land, sea, and air. 80 She became the first reigning monarch of Australia and New Zealand to visit those nations. 81 During the tour, crowds were immense, 3/4 of the population of Australia were estimated to have seen her. 82 Throughout her reign, the Queen had made hundreds of state visits to other countries and tours of the Commonwealth. She was the most widely travelled head of state. 83 In 1956, the British and French Prime Ministers, Sir Anthony Eden and Guy Mollet, discussed the possibility of France joining the Commonwealth. The proposal was never accepted, and the following year France signed the Treaty of Rome, which established the European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union. 84 In November 1956, Britain and France invaded Egypt in an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to capture the Suez Canal. Lord Mountbatten said the Queen was opposed to the invasion, though Eden denied it. Eden resigned 2 months later. 85. A formal group of Elizabeth in tiara and evening dress with 11 politicians in evening dress or national costume. With Commonwealth leaders at the 1960 Commonwealth's resignation, it fell to the Queen to decide whom to commission to form a government. Eden recommended she consult Lord Salisbury, the Lord President of the Council. Lord Salisbury and Lord Kilmuir, the Lord Chancellor, consulted the British Cabinet, Churchill, and the chairman of the Backbench 1922 Committee, resulting in the Queen appointing their recommended candidate, Harold Macmillan. 86. Seated with Philip on thrones at Canadian Parliament, 1957. The Suez Crisis and the choice of Eden's successor led, in 1957, to the first major personal criticism of the Queen. In a magazine, which he owned and edited, 87, Lord Altrincham accused her of being out of touch. 88, Altrincham was denounced by public figures and slapped by a member of the public appalled by his comments. 89, 6 years later, in 1963, Macmillan resigned and advised the Queen to appoint the Earl of Home as Prime Minister, advice she followed. 90, the Queen again came under criticism for appointing the Prime Minister on the advice of a small number of ministers or a single minister. 90, in 1965, the Conservatives adopted a formal mechanism for electing a leader, thus relieving her of involvement. 91. In 1957, Elizabeth made a state visit to the United States, where she addressed the United Nations General Assembly on behalf of the Commonwealth. On the same tour, she opened the 23rd Canadian Parliament, becoming the first monarch of Canada to open a parliamentary session. 92, 2 years later, solely in her capacity as Queen of Canada, she revisited the United States and toured Canada. 92-93, in 1961, she toured Cyprus, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Iran. 94, on a visit to Ghana the same year, she dismissed fears for her safety, even though her host, President Kwame Nkrumah, who had replaced her as head of state, was a target for assassins. 95, Harold Macmillan wrote, "The Queen has been absolutely determined all through. She is impatient of the attitude towards her to treat her as a film star. She has indeed the heart and stomach of a man. She loves her duty and means to be a queen." 95. Before her tour through parts of Quebec in 1964, the press reported extremists within the Quebec separatist movement were plotting Elizabeth's assassination. 96-97, no attempt was made, but a riot did break out while she was in Montreal. The Queen's calmness and courage in the face of the violence was noted. 98. Elizabeth gave birth to her third child, Prince Andrew, on February 19, 1960, which was the first birth to a reigning British monarch since 1857. 99, her fourth child, Prince Edward, was born on March 10, 1964. 100. In addition to performing traditional ceremonies, the Queen had also instituted new practices. Her first royal walkabout, meeting ordinary members of the public, took place during a tour of Australia and New Zealand in 1970. 101. Acceleration of decolonization. In Queensland, Australia, 1970. With President Tito of Yugoslavia in Belgrade, 1972. The 1960s and 1970s saw an acceleration in the decolonization of Africa and the Caribbean. More than 20 countries gained independence from Britain as part of a planned transition to self-government. In 1965, however, the Rhodesian Prime Minister, Ian Smith, in opposition to moves towards majority rule, unilaterally declared independence while expressing loyalty and devotion to Elizabeth, declaring her Queen of Rhodesia. 102, although the Queen formally dismissed him, and the international community applied sanctions against Rhodesia, his regime survived for over a decade. 103, as Britain's ties to its former empire weakened, the British government sought entry to the European community, a goal it achieved in 1973. 104. The Queen toured Yugoslavia in October 1972, becoming the first British monarch to visit a communist country. 105 She was received at the airport by President Josip Broz Tito, and a crowd of thousands greeted her in Belgrade. 106 In February 1974, the British Prime Minister, Edward Heath, advised the Queen to call a general election in the middle of her tour of the Austronesian Pacific Rim, requiring her to fly back to Britain. 107 The election resulted in a hung parliament. Heath's Conservatives were not the largest party, but could stay in office if they formed a coalition with the Liberals. When discussions on forming a coalition foundered, Heath resigned as Prime Minister and the Queen asked the leader of the opposition, Labour's Harold Wilson, to form a government. 108 A year later, at the height of the 1975 Australian constitutional crisis, the Australian Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, was dismissed from his post by Governor-General Sir John Kerr, after the opposition-controlled Senate rejected Whitlam's budget proposals. 109 As Whitlam had a majority in the House of Representatives, Speaker Gordon Scholes appealed to the Queen to reverse Kerr's decision. She declined, saying she would not interfere in decisions reserved by the Constitution of Australia for the Governor-General. 110 The crisis fueled Australian republicanism. 109 Silver Jubilee. Leaders of the G7 states, members of the royal family and Elizabeth, Centre, London, 1977. In 1977, Elizabeth marked the Silver Jubilee of her accession. Parties and events took place throughout the Commonwealth, many coinciding with her associated national and Commonwealth tours. The celebrations reaffirmed the Queen's popularity, despite virtually coincident negative press coverage of Princess Margaret's separation from her husband, Lord Snowdon. 111 In 1978, the Queen endured a state visit to the United Kingdom by Romania's communist leader, Nicolae Ceausescu, and his wife, Elena. 112 Though privately she thought they had blood on their hands. 113 The following year brought two blows. One was the unmasking of Anthony Blunt, former surveyor of the Queen's pictures, as a communist spy. The other was the assassination of her relative and in-law Lord Mountbatten by the Provisional Irish Republican Army. 114 According to Paul Martin Sr., by the end of the 1970s the Queen was worried the Crown had little meaning for Pierre Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. 115 Tony Benn said the Queen found Trudeau rather disappointing. 115 Trudeau's supposed republicanism seemed to be confirmed by his antics, such as sliding down banisters at Buckingham Palace and pirouetting behind the Queen's back in 1977, and the removal of various Canadian royal symbols during his term of office. 115 In 1980, Canadian politicians sent to London to discuss the patriation of the Canadian Constitution found the Queen better informed than any of the British politicians or bureaucrats. 115 She was particularly interested after the failure of Bill C-60, which would have affected her role as head of state. 115 Press scrutiny and Thatcher premiership. Elizabeth in red uniform on a black horse, riding Burmese at the 1986 Trooping the Colour ceremony. During the 1981 Trooping the Colour ceremony, 6 weeks before the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer, 6 shots were fired at the Queen from close range as she rode down the Mall, London, on her horse, Burmese. Police later discovered the shots were blanks. The 17-year-old assailant, Marcus Sargent, was sentenced to 5 years in prison and released after 3. 116 The Queen's composure and skill in controlling her mount were widely praised. 117 That October the Queen was the subject of another attack while on a visit to Dunedin, New Zealand. Christopher John Lewis, who was 17 years old, fired a shot with a .22 rifle from the 5th floor of a building overlooking the parade, but missed. 118 Lewis was arrested, but never charged with attempted murder or treason, and sentenced to 3 years in jail for unlawful possession and discharge of a firearm. 2 years into his sentence, he attempted to escape a psychiatric hospital with the intention of assassinating Charles, who was visiting the country with Diana and their son Prince William. 119. Elizabeth and Ronald Reagan on black horses. He bareheaded, she in a headscarf, both in tweeds, jodhpurs, and riding boots. Riding at Windsor with President Reagan, June 1982. From April to September 1982, the Queen's son, Prince Andrew, served with British forces in the Falklands War, for which she reportedly felt anxiety 120 and pride. 121 On July 9, she awoke in her bedroom at Buckingham Palace to find an intruder, Michael Fagan, in the room with her. In a serious lapse of security, assistance only arrived after 2 calls to the palace police switchboard. 122 After hosting U.S. President Ronald Reagan at Windsor Castle in 1982 and visiting his California ranch in 1983, the Queen was angered when his administration ordered the invasion of Grenada, one of her Caribbean realms, without informing her. 123. Intense media interest in the opinions and private lives of the royal family during the 1980s led to a series of sensational stories in the press, not all of which were entirely true. 124 As Kelvin Mackenzie, editor of The Sun, told his staff, "Give me a Sunday for Monday splash on the royals. Don't worry if it's not true so long as there's not too much of a fuss about it afterwards." 125. Newspaper editor Donald Trulford wrote in The Observer of September 21, 1986, "The royal soap opera has now reached such a pitch of public interest that the boundary between fact and fiction has been lost sight of. It is not just that some papers don't check their facts or accept denials, they don't care if the stories are true or not." It was reported, most notably in the Sunday Times of July 20, 1986, that the Queen was worried that Margaret Thatcher's economic policies fostered social divisions and was alarmed by high unemployment, a series of riots, the violence of a miners' strike, and Thatcher's refusal to apply sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. The sources of the rumors included royal aide Michael Shea and Commonwealth Secretary General Shridath Ramphal, but Shea claimed his remarks were taken out of context and embellished by speculation. 126 Thatcher reputedly said the Queen would vote for the Social Democratic Party, Thatcher's political opponents. 127 Thatcher's biographer, John Campbell, claimed the report was a piece of journalistic mischief-making. 128 reports of acrimony between them were exaggerated. 129 And the Queen gave 2 honors in her personal gift: membership in the Order of Merit and the Order of the Garter to Thatcher after her replacement as Prime Minister by John Major. 130 Brian Mulroney, Canadian Prime Minister between 1984 and 1993, said Elizabeth was a behind-the-scenes force in ending apartheid. 131 132. In 1986, the Queen paid a 6-day state visit to China, becoming the first British monarch to visit the country. 133 The tour included the Forbidden City, the Great Wall of China, and the Terracotta Warriors. 134 At a state banquet, the Queen joked about the first British emissary to China being lost at sea with Queen Elizabeth I's letter to the Wanli Emperor, and remarked, "Fortunately postal services have improved since 1602. 135 The Queen's visit also signified the acceptance of both countries that sovereignty over Hong Kong would be transferred from the United Kingdom to China in 1997. 136. By the end of the 1980s, the Queen had become the target of satire. 137 The involvement of younger members of the royal family in the charity game show It's a Royal Knockout in 1987 was ridiculed. 138 In Canada, Elizabeth publicly supported politically divisive constitutional amendments, prompting criticism from opponents of the proposed changes, including Pierre Trudeau. 131 The same year, the elected Fijian government was deposed in a military coup. As monarch of Fiji, Elizabeth supported the attempts of Governor-General Ratu Sirpina Aganilo to assert executive power and negotiate a settlement. Coup leader Sitiveni Rabuka deposed Ganilo and declared Fiji a republic. 139. Turbulent 1990s and Annus Horribilis. Elizabeth, in formal dress, holds a pair of spectacles to her mouth in a thoughtful pose. Philip and Elizabeth in Germany, October 1992. In the wake of coalition victory in the Gulf War, the Queen became the first British monarch to address a joint meeting of the United States Congress in May 1991. 140. On November 24, 1992, in a speech to mark the Ruby Jubilee of her accession to the throne, Elizabeth called 1992 her Annus Horribilis, a Latin phrase, meaning horrible year. 141. Republican feeling in Britain had risen because of press estimates of the Queen's private wealth contradicted by the palace and reports of affairs and strained marriages among her extended family. 142. In March, her second son, Prince Andrew, separated from his wife, Sarah, and Mauritius removed Elizabeth as head of state. Her daughter, Princess Anne, divorced Captain Mark Phillips in April. 143. Angry demonstrators in Dresden threw eggs at the Queen during a state visit to Germany in October 144, and a large fire broke out at Windsor Castle, one of her official residences, in November. The monarchy came under increased criticism and public scrutiny. 145. In an unusually personal speech, the Queen said that any institution must expect criticism, but suggested it might be done with a touch of humor, gentleness, and understanding. 146. 2 days later, Prime Minister John Major announced plans to reform the royal finances, drawn up the previous year, including the Queen paying income tax from 1993 onwards, and a reduction in the civil list. 147. In December, Prince Charles and his wife, Diana, formally separated. 148. At the end of the year, the Queen sued the Sun newspaper for breach of copyright when it published the text of her annual Christmas message 2 days before it was broadcast. The newspaper was forced to pay her legal fees and donated £200,000 to charity. 149. The Queen's solicitors had taken action against the Sun 5 years earlier for breach of copyright, after it published a photograph of her daughter-in-law the Duchess of York and her granddaughter Princess Beatrice. The case was solved with an out-of-court settlement that ordered the newspaper to pay $180,000. 150. In January 1994, the Queen broke the scaphoid bone in her left wrist as the horse she was riding at Sandringham House tripped and fell. 151. In October 1994, she became the first reigning British monarch to set foot on Russian soil. 154. During the 4-day visit, which is considered to be one of the most important foreign trips of the Queen's reign. 155. She and Philip attended events in Moscow and St. Petersburg. 156. In October 1995, the Queen was tricked into a hoax call by Montreal radio host Pierre Brassard impersonating Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. The Queen, who believed that she was speaking to Chrétien, said she supported Canadian unity, and would try to influence Quebec's referendum on proposals to break away from Canada. 157. 158. In the year that followed, public revelations on the state of Charles and Diana's marriage continued. 159. In consultation with her husband and John Major, as well as the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, and her private secretary, Robert Fellows, Elizabeth wrote to Charles and Diana at the end of December 1995, suggesting that a divorce would be advisable. 160. In August 1997, a year after the divorce, Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris. The Queen was on holiday with her extended family at Balmoral. Diana's 2 sons, Princes William and Harry, wanted to attend church, so the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh took them that morning. 161. Afterwards, for 5 days the royal couple shielded their grandsons from the intense press interest by keeping them at Balmoral where they could grieve in private. 162. But the royal family's silence and seclusion, and the failure to fly a flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, caused public dismay. 132-163 Pressured by the hostile reaction, the Queen agreed to return to London and address the nation in a live television broadcast on September 5, the day before Diana's funeral. 164 In the broadcast, she expressed admiration for Diana and her feelings as a grandmother for the two princes. 165 As a result, much of the public hostility evaporated. 165. In October 1997, Elizabeth and Philip made a state visit to India, which included a controversial visit to the site of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre to pay her respects. Protesters chanted "Killer Queen, go back." 166 And there were demands for her to apologize for the action of British troops 78 years earlier. 167 At the memorial in the park, she and the Duke paid their respects by laying a wreath and stood for a 30-second moment of silence. 167 As a result, much of the fury among the public softened and the protests were called off. 166. In November of that year, the Queen and her husband held a reception at Banqueting House to mark their golden wedding anniversary. 168 Elizabeth made a speech and praised Philip for his role as a consort, referring to him as "my strength and stay." 168. Golden Jubilee. At a Golden Jubilee dinner with British Prime Minister Tony Blair and former Prime Ministers, 2002. From left to right, Blair, Margaret Thatcher, Edward Heath, Elizabeth, James Callaghan, and John Major. On the eve of the new millennium, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh boarded a vessel from Southwark, bound for the Millennium Dome. Before passing under Tower Bridge, the Queen lit the National Millennium Beacon in the Pool of London using a laser torch. 169-170 Shortly before midnight, she officially opened the dome. 171 During the singing of Auld Lang Syne, the Queen held hands with the Duke and British Prime Minister Tony Blair. 172-173. In 2002, the Queen marked her Golden Jubilee, the 50th anniversary of her accession. Her sister and mother died in February and March respectively, and the media speculated on whether the Jubilee would be a success or a failure. 174 She again undertook an extensive tour of her realms, beginning in Jamaica in February, where she called the farewell banquet memorable after a power cut plunged the King's House, the official residence of the Governor-General, into darkness. 175 As in 1977, there were street parties and commemorative events, and monuments were named to honor the occasion. 1 million people attended each day of the three-day main Jubilee celebration in London. 176 And the enthusiasm shown for the Queen by the public was greater than many journalists had anticipated. 177. Greeting NASA employees at the Goddard Space Flight Center, Maryland, May 2007. In 2003, the Queen sued Daily Mirror for breach of confidence and obtained an injunction which prevented the outlet from publishing information gathered by a reporter who posed as a footman at Buckingham Palace. 178 The newspaper also paid £25,000 towards her legal costs. 179 Though generally healthy throughout her life, in 2003 the Queen had keyhole surgery on both knees. In October 2006, she missed the opening of the new Emirates Stadium because of a strained back muscle that had been troubling her since the summer. 180. In May 2007, citing unnamed sources, the Daily Telegraph reported that the Queen was exasperated and frustrated by the policies of Tony Blair, that she was concerned the British armed forces were overstretched in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that she had raised concerns over rural and countryside issues with Blair. 181 She was, however, said to admire Blair's efforts to achieve peace in Northern Ireland. 182 She became the first British monarch to celebrate a diamond wedding anniversary in November 2007. 183 On March 20, 2008, at the Church of Ireland's St. Patrick's Cathedral, Armagh, the Queen attended the first Maundy service held outside England and Wales. 184. Elizabeth addressed the UN General Assembly for a second time in 2010, again in her capacity as Queen of all Commonwealth realms and head of the Commonwealth. 185 The UN Secretary-General, Ban Ki-moon, introduced her as an anchor for our age. 186 During her visit to New York, which followed a tour of Canada, she officially opened a memorial garden for British victims of the September 11 attacks. 186 The Queen's 11-day visit to Australia in October 2011 was her 16th visit to the country since 1954. 187 By invitation of the Irish President, Mary McAleese, she made the first state visit to the Republic of Ireland by a British monarch in May 2011. 188. Diamond Jubilee and Longevity. Visiting Birmingham in July 2012 as part of the Diamond Jubilee Tour. The Queen's 2012 Diamond Jubilee marked 60 years on the throne, and celebrations were held throughout her realms, the wider Commonwealth, and beyond. She and her husband undertook an extensive tour of the United Kingdom, while her children and grandchildren embarked on royal tours of other Commonwealth states on her behalf. 189 190 On June 4, Jubilee beacons were lit around the world. 191 While touring Manchester as part of her Jubilee celebrations, the Queen made a surprise appearance at a wedding party at Manchester Town Hall, which then made international headlines. 192 In November, the Queen and her husband celebrated their blue sapphire wedding anniversary, 65th. 193 On December 18, she became the first British sovereign to attend a peacetime cabinet meeting since George III in 1781. 194. The Queen, who opened the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal, also opened the 2012 Summer Olympics and Paralympics in London, making her the first head of state to open two Olympic Games in two countries. 195 For the London Olympics, she played herself in a short film as part of the opening ceremony, alongside Daniel Craig as James Bond. 196 On April 4, 2013, she received an honorary BAFTA for her patronage of the film industry and was called the most memorable Bond girl yet at the award ceremony. 197. Opening the Borders Railway on the day she became the longest reigning British monarch, 2015. In her speech, she said she had never aspired to achieve that milestone. 198. On March 3, 2013, Elizabeth stayed overnight at King Edward VII's Hospital as a precaution after developing symptoms of gastroenteritis. 199 A week later, she signed the new Charter of the Commonwealth. 200 Because of her age and the need for her to limit traveling, in 2013 she chose not to attend the biennial Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting for the first time in 40 years. She was represented at the summit in Sri Lanka by Prince Charles. 201 On April 20, 2018, the Commonwealth Heads of Government announced that she will be succeeded by Charles as head of the Commonwealth, which she stated was her sincere wish. 202 She underwent cataract surgery in May 2018. 203 In March 2019, she gave up driving on public roads, largely as a consequence of a car crash involving her husband 2 months earlier. 204. The Queen surpassed her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, to become the longest-lived British monarch on December 21, 2007, and the longest-reigning British monarch and longest-reigning Queen regnant and female head of state in the world on September 9, 2015. 205 206 207 She became the oldest current monarch after King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia died on January 23, 2015. 208 209 She later became the longest reigning current monarch and the longest serving current head of state following the death of King Bhumibol of Thailand on 13 October 2016. 210 211 and the oldest current head of state on the resignation of Robert Mugabe on November 21, 2017. 212-213 On February 6, 2017, she became the first British monarch to commemorate a sapphire jubilee. 214 And on November 20, she was the first British monarch to celebrate a platinum wedding anniversary. 215 Philip had retired from his official duties as the Queen's consort in August 2017. 216. COVID-19 pandemic. In a virtual meeting with Dame Cindy Kiro during the COVID-19 pandemic, October 2021. On March 19, 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United Kingdom, the Queen moved to Windsor Castle and sequestered there as a precaution. 217 public engagements were cancelled and Windsor Castle followed a strict sanitary protocol nicknamed HMS Bubble. 218 On April 5, in a televised broadcast watched by an estimated 24 million viewers in the UK. 219 She asked people to take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return, we will be with our friends again, we will be with our families again, we will meet again. 220. On May 8, the 75th anniversary of VE Day, in a TV broadcast at 9 p.m. the exact time at which her father George VI had broadcast to the nation on the same day in 1945, she asked people to never give up, never despair. 221 In October, she visited the UK's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory in Wiltshire, her first public engagement since the start of the pandemic. 222 On November 4, she appeared masked for the first time in public, during a private pilgrimage to the tomb of the unknown warrior at Westminster Abbey, to mark the centenary of his burial. 223 In 2021, she received her first and second COVID-19 vaccinations in January and April respectively. 224-225. Prince Philip died on April 9, 2021, after 73 years of marriage, making Elizabeth the first British monarch to reign as a widow or widower since Queen Victoria. 226-200